All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 28, Section 3, The American Dream. So we're going to begin with the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was elected president in 1952. And Dwight Eisenhower, let's see if I could write that better. 1952. There we go. Dwight Eisenhower, his nickname was Ike. So Ike is Eisenhower's nickname. There you can see Dwight D. Eisenhower pictured right here. And in the 1952 presidential election, you can see very clearly that he won a majority of the blue states. So most of the country voted for him. And of course, he was a well-liked American president for a number of reasons. One, his war service. He had been the commander at D-Day. In fact, he was in charge of Allied forces in Europe. So in a sense, he was the war hero of World War II in Europe. And he was very much nonpartisan, which means he had no political allegiance. Even though he was a Republican, even Harry Truman, the former Democratic president, said that he liked Eisenhower so much he would vote for him. And it's not very common that you get members of the opposing political party endorsing somebody from the other aisle. So very much a nonpartisan. He was seen much more as an American president as opposed to a Republican president or a Democratic president. Even in his policies, so for example, Eisenhower continued some of the New Deal programs that were characteristic of Democratic presidents of the day. So he was well-liked for that reason. During his presidency, though, he continued an escalation of the Cold War, including a policy of massive retaliation. Massive retaliation was the policy the U.S. Would take, or the policy the U.S. I will say would take, if the Soviet Union launches a first strike. In other words, Eisenhower wanted to make it clear that if the Soviet Union started anything, the United States would retaliate with, its entire arsenal, which was probably just obvious to begin with, but Eisenhower really made it a point to say, in the case of a Soviet first strike, massive retaliation would be the answer. And this created a very dangerous world in which MAD, or mutually assured destruction, would be achieved if the Soviet Union and the United States went to war. The technology was as such. The arms race, or the buildup in both of their militaries, the Soviets and the Americans, reached the point by about maybe the 1960s or so, at the end of Eisenhower's time in office, that if a war were to break out, both the Soviets and the Americans had the firepower to assure each other's destruction. Both nations would be completely wiped out. Now, despite the fact that Eisenhower was, a man who was very much involved in the military, when he left office, he warned about the military-industrial complex, and that was the growing influence of the U.S. military, and kind of the economy connected to it. The United States had invested so much in its military, and the military built up during the Cold War in terms of technology, in terms of dollars, in terms of how important it was, that Eisenhower warned that, this might get out of control, and the United States ought to be aware. He says this while leaving office. Be aware of the military-industrial complex and how much it can influence American society. Now, this is coming at a time where Americans are very much faced with the real possibility that a nuclear attack can occur. And so, for example, you had in schools things like duck and cover drills in the case of a nuclear attack. You had people who bought nuclear bunkers in the case of a nuclear attack. So, even though we look back at the 1950s and say, well, maybe a lot of that was exaggeration and hysteria, we have to also remember that it was a very real possibility that a nuclear war could have broken out. It turned out not to be the case. We benefit from hindsight in knowing that. The people who lived in the 1950s obviously didn't know that. To go along with the military buildup, which we sometimes call the arms race. So the arms race is the military buildup of the Soviet Union and United States. Also was a technological race, sometimes referred to as the space race. One of the key components of the Cold War was, which system, which ideology could give us the technology of the future. And so both the Soviets and the Americans competed over who can bring the latest and greatest technology. Some of this had its origins in computing. Alan Turing was a British scientist. He created the first code-breaking machine. And this, in some ways, was kind of like the first computer. And so especially when it came to computing technologies, that would be sort of one of the central aspects or central parts of this advancement in technology. But the space race was also this competition over which nation could explore space first, could achieve various accomplishments. The Soviets were the first one to act. The Sputnik was the first satellite in space. This was a Soviet device. Here's actually a picture of Sputnik here. It was really just a hunk of metal. But the fear was that the Soviets could perhaps put something like weapons in space. And so the United States responded with the National Defense Education Act, which set aside money for U.S. students related to defense. All right, so these would be extra funds set aside for students who can go to college, learn things like mathematics, learn computing, learn foreign languages, so that the United States wouldn't fall too far behind this technological race with the Soviet Union. Education was incredibly important. When it came to intervention, though, Eisenhower was surprisingly not much of an interventionist. So he was a little bit less hesitant, whereas before we saw Truman intervening via the United Nations through Korea. There are a couple of examples where the United States does not intervene. French Indochina saw the French fighting against the Vietnamese, even though the United States sent money and military supplies to France, which represented the capitalist side of this. The Vietnamese represented the communist side of this conflict. U.S. forces were not sent there. An attempted uprising in Hungary, in which students tried to overthrow communist rule. Eisenhower did not send in any U.S. troops there. And in the case of the Suez Canal, when Egypt fought against Great Britain for control of that vital waterway, Great Britain representing the American ally, Egypt representing the Soviet or communist ally, Eisenhower did not intervene in that either. So in both of these cases, we had a non-intervention. Now, that's not to say that Eisenhower backed down from the Cold War, but these were just a couple of examples where troops were not sent in when perhaps they could have. Meanwhile, back at home, the 1950s is a time period of a growing middle class, a growing prosperity. The Great Depression, which had characterized the United States prior to the war, was wiped out. And instead, a lot of the war-related jobs that gave people paychecks, that gave them savings, once the war was over and rationing was done with, people could then go out and buy a house, buy a car. And so this led to somewhat of a post-war economic boom, right, which occurred in the U.S. A growing middle class. And in order to make some of these commodities more available, you had new innovative techniques of production. Levitt towns were mass-produced housing, right? So William Levitt pretty much took the assembly line, which had made Ford's Model T so cheap and affordable. He applied it to home building. And these homes that were built in the 1950s in what they called the suburbs, a suburb is an area located outside of the city. They were built they were built identically with one another, but they were built so efficiently and cheaply that you could buy one for a mere $8,000, a new house. And many Americans moved to the suburbs and bought homes for the very first time, right? The suburbs grew significantly. The automobile could serve as the sort of connection between the suburbs where the home was, right, and the city where the workplace was. And the U.S. government helped out by building more interstate highways. So government built an interstate, which means stretching across the country, a highway system. And even though the highway system was created for, other reasons like defense purposes, in the case of an attack during the Cold War, a lot of people use these highways to commute from the suburbs into the cities where they work. So the United States not only increased in terms of prosperity, but also kind of spread out in terms of where people were located, more and more so in the suburbs. We have a picture of a highway right here. And that is to say that also 1950s culture was really sort of based off this middle-class prosperity, suburbanization, et cetera, et cetera. Prosperity, uniformity, and conformity, right? We're already familiar with the prosperity part. Uniformity and conformity pretty much means that, there was not really a lot of individualness in the 1950s. There was not a lot of uniqueness. The mass production of goods like houses, everybody had a car and had a home, which was great, but everybody had the same car and had the same home and had the same kind of culture. So, and there's a very strong sort of sense that one should conform to the dominant culture of the time. This was reinforced a lot by TV. So, for example, family life was very, very uniform across the United States. Marriage typically was a lot younger. So, marry young. Right. First of all, get married. Divorce rates were very low. Families tended to stay together. The baby boom, more children. Try this again. Children were born from 1946 to 1964 than ever in U.S. history. And in terms of gender roles and responsibilities, typically the women remained at home as housewives, and the men were considered to be breadwinners. That means they provided the only source of income for the family. And so, you go to pretty much any American city during the 1950s, and you'll find that couples are getting married at a very young age. They're having lots and lots and lots of children, and they have this typical gender division of labor, which does, on the one hand, does provide a standard of living that really hadn't been experienced in the United States before, especially if you consider the Great Depression, right? The ability to sort of live this sort of prosperous and enjoy the material benefit of the 1950s. But at the same time, like we said, there's a loss of uniqueness. There's a loss of individualness. For women, there's a loss of opportunity. There's sort of being pigeonholed in certain roles in society where maybe one is not the most comfortable with or even desires.